Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I'm going to talk about active learning. Active learning is the best way to study and improve your English ability. But most language learners do not learn actively. How can you become an active English learner? Keep listening to find out. And why not head over to the Thinking in English blog, where you can find today's full transcript for free over there for you to read. Have a look at my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, and leave a like or a follow wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's episode. How do you study English? I want you to take a few seconds to think about all the different ways you have studied English in the past and how you are currently studying today. Did you take classes at school or university? Private English lessons online? Have you bought textbooks? Do you listen to English podcasts? Do you go to language exchange events? Do you watch movies or TV shows? There are hundreds of different approaches to language learning. My students in the past had tried so many different things and tactics to try to reach the advanced levels of English. And I have also tried all of these methods in an effort to improve my Japanese language ability. For about 3 years, I would listen to Japanese language podcasts and watch Japanese TV shows on Netflix with the idea that I was studying. My Japanese language never really improved, but I figured this was just because I wasn't studying enough. I started listening to more Japanese language content online, and I would use a few vocabulary learning apps as I walked to work every day. But my language level was still not improving. Then, last year, I moved to Japan. Great! I will be able to quickly pick up my language again. That was the first thing I thought. Being in the country and hearing Japanese all the time would make it easy to improve, right? I remembered the first time I lived in Japan, back in 2016, when my language ability went from completely zero to upper intermediate in only 2 years. I assumed it would be the same this time. It didn't. For the first 6 or so months living in Tokyo, my Japanese level barely improved. So, what was going wrong? I spent a lot of time watching Japanese Netflix, listening to Japanese podcasts, and living in Japan. Why was I not improving? I'm sure you can all recognize my story, and maybe you have had similar experience to me. No matter how many hours I spent studying in these ways, I couldn't improve. I mentioned that the first time I moved to Japan in 2016, my Japanese level quickly improved from zero to intermediate in a relatively short time. I think comparing my approach to studying back then and now will help to explain what was going wrong. In 2016, I moved to Japan as an English teacher with absolutely no experience of studying Japanese. So, I dedicated most of my free time to studying and learning Japanese. I bought myself 2 textbooks, which I would use every day after I finished work. I would learn the vocabulary and grammar, answer all of the questions, but also create my own sentences, and then try to use the grammar in real situations. I attended 2 or 3 community classes a week and would spend an hour before or after the classes talking with my teachers in Japanese. At the beginning, it was incredibly difficult. I joined the beginners class about 4 months late, which meant everyone had experience with the language already. But as I learned more Japanese, from both the class and my textbooks, I was able to have more detailed conversations with the teachers. I also worked in a largely Japanese environment. I taught at junior high schools and elementary schools in the Ehime prefecture of Japan. If you don't know anything about Japan, this is a very rural part of the country. At my main school, two teachers could speak English, but other than that, every teacher at every school spoke only Japanese. My boss at the city government's Board of Education also couldn't speak Japanese. Oh, sorry, couldn't speak any English. She could only speak Japanese. So, what does this mean? Well, I had to use Japanese every single day. And I had the opportunity to use and practice the things that I learned in textbooks and classes all of the time. How about now? Well, since I moved to Tokyo, things have been very different. I work in primarily an English language environment. My professors, classmates at the graduate school I attend are all English speakers. I write and I work in English. And when I first moved to Tokyo, it was during the start of a long period of COVID restrictions. It was really difficult to go out and make new friends. So the only people I actually met were people from the graduate school. And in my spare time, I wouldn't study Japanese. I would work on my podcast or teach English for some extra money. Even though I was still studying Japanese, watching Netflix and listening to podcasts, and occasionally using textbooks, I wasn't actually actively using Japanese. I was passively learning, listening, watching, and trying to remember things without actually engaging with or trying to use the material. This is one of the biggest problems facing English learners as well. We often hope that passive learning will help us improve, but in reality, active learning is a much more effective and useful approach. Today, I'll explain the difference between passive and active language learning, and then give you some tips and advice on how to become a more active and successful English learner. And at the same time, I'll also provide some personal anecdotes about my journey towards becoming a more active language learner. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with passive learning. Passive learning is a really common approach to language learning. In fact, I guess that around 90% of you are passive learning right now while you are listening to Thinking in English. Passive learning can be simply described as receiving information or content. You are not producing English yourself. Instead, someone else produces the content, and you simply sit back, listen or watch, and try to absorb the information. I guess this is how many of you listen to Thinking in English. And it is certainly how I have listened and watched Japanese media over the years. Passive learning is probably recognizable for most of us. At school and university, I spent countless hours sitting and listening to my teachers and lecturers. But how much was I really engaging with what they were saying? Probably not that much. My approach to learning Japanese over the past few years has also been incredibly passive. I'd watch shows on Netflix while relaxing. I'd listen to podcasts while working. And I'd use language learning apps while daydreaming. I was certainly not engaging with all the content, processing the information, and actively using the language. We often associate passive learning with listening activities, but you can be a passive learner in other regards too, all of the different skills of English. For the first few months of living in Tokyo, most of my Japanese speaking was relatively passive. That's right, speaking can be passive too. I would use the same basic phrases every time I ordered from a restaurant and a cafe. And when I met Japanese people, I would tend to have the same basic conversations every time. Where do I come from? What am I doing in Japan? These kinds of things. So I was not thinking critically about what I was saying, and I wasn't using new language. What is active learning? Active learning is basically the opposite of passive learning. Rather than sitting and letting the content simply be delivered to you, you interact and engage with what you are studying. In other words, you take control of your own learning. I'm sure most of us enjoy sitting back and watching a movie at night with a cup of tea, and perhaps you put on an English movie with subtitles and tell yourself you are studying. But really, your brain isn't actively working when you passively watch a movie. It's fun, but it isn't really studying. Instead, actively watching a TV show or movie would involve noting down expressions and vocabulary you haven't heard before, or shadowing conversations, or writing a summary of what you have just watched afterwards. This might sound like a lot of work, but remember you are studying English. Of course, it is fine to relax and watch something on Netflix, but you should clearly distinguish between studying English and watching TV for fun. Sometimes it's okay to study English, and sometimes it's okay to have fun. But make sure in your brain you know when you are doing which activity. Our brains make new memories when they do something. It is much easier to remember a word or a grammar rule once you have forced yourself to use it in speech or writing. Rather than just copying vocabulary out of a textbook, you should create your own example sentences or vocabulary flashcards. Rather than just speaking in prepared sentences, you should try to use new expressions in every conversation. You should read books and make notes of words you don't know. And you should write in English. Perhaps write a diary or a blog in English. How about listening to a podcast? Listening to thinking in English is a passive way of learning, right? Well, no, sometimes. It depends on you. If you search for the words you don't know, if you use the vocabulary list to create your own sentences, if you think critically about the content of the episodes, if you use these topics and write summaries or have conversations in English with your friends about what I'm talking about, you are being an active learner. I always end the episode on a question, and answering these questions gives you the opportunity to use English actively. So make sure you listen to the end of the episode, listen to my questions, and then answer. You can always answer on Spotify, or you can send me a message on Instagram if you don't listen on Spotify. So you might be thinking right now that you should never use passive learning, but that is not necessarily the case. Passive learning tends to be more enjoyable and less tiring, and you can do other things at the same time. I regularly listen to Japanese language podcasts while writing my podcasts, or research papers, or taking the train in the morning. There is a time and a place for passive learning. I'm sure many of you listen to Thinking in English while driving or running, walking the dog, cleaning your house, or sitting on the bus. And I hope it's enjoyable to do so. However, think about it this way. Do you think you would learn more if you listened to Thinking in English while driving to work, or if you listened while making notes on the expressions and new vocabulary that you hear? Do you think you will learn more English by copying words out of a textbook or by creating your own sentences with new vocabulary? Do you think you will learn more English by watching a YouTube video or by having a real conversation with a language exchange partner? If you dedicate your time to studying and using language and dedicate 100% of your effort, you will notice gradual and steady improvements. Being an active learner will make you a successful English learner. And if you have struggled to improve your abilities in recent years, the problem is likely your passive approach to learning. How about me? Am I an active language learner? I told the story at the beginning of the episode, which covered why I wasn't improving in my Japanese ability. Basically, I was far too passive in my approach to learning. So recently, I decided to take a much more active approach to learning. I currently take three different Japanese conversation classes, focusing on personal conversations, debating, and public speaking. Each of these classes have forced me to regularly learn and use new expressions and vocabulary. For example, 2 weeks ago, I had to prepare a debate about whether 24-hour opening hours for convenience stores should be stopped in Japan. Before the class, I prepared and researched a lot of different arguments, as well as some grammar I could use in a debate. During the first half of the class, I discussed with my partner about our different ideas and decided which arguments we would use and which roles we would take. And then during the debate, I had to express my opinion clearly and respond to the questions asked by my opponents. All of this was using vocabulary I didn't know last month. And all of this was in Japanese. Moreover, I have been visiting my local bar and coffee shop in Tokyo every week for the purpose of practicing Japanese. Well, to be honest, I also like drinking coffee and beer. But a major motivating factor is that I am able to have conversations with real people and discuss a wide variety of different topics with other regular customers. Sometimes I even prepare a topic before I go and then try to have a conversation using some of the vocabulary I prepared. This is an incredibly active way of learning and practicing Japanese, but is also enjoyable. So, I guess in summary, I am becoming a more active learner. I still need to take a more active approach to listening to podcasts and watching TV shows, but in terms of speaking, I have definitely become more active over the past 3 months, and I can feel the difference. I have no problem going to my local bar, speaking to 4 or 5 different people in the night, and having 4 or 5 different conversations. And although there are times where I don't understand what is being said, I can generally talk about a wide variety of different things. And if I don't know a word, people are generally really nice and they try to explain or let me search on Google Translate for what they are talking about. Sometimes the words are words I don't even know in English. So I think this approach to being active has really helped boost my confidence and improve my ability at the same time. In summary, active listening requires you to think about, engage with, and process information in an active way. Rather than just listening to a podcast or watching a YouTube video, active learners use such content as study materials. Make notes, search words you don't know, write summaries, answer questions, Transcribe podcasts or shadow movies. All of these are active ways of learning. Does this mean you should never learn passively? Not necessarily. When you're driving or running or sitting on the train, use that opportunity to listen to a podcast, of course. But you should also remember that active learning is far more effective. It might be tiring and it might require 100% of your effort, but it is the superior learning method. Are you an active learner? Tell me how you study English in the comments. And do you have any advice on how to become a more active learner? I'm sure all of the listeners of Thinking in English would be really interested to find out. So leave a comment on the blog or leave a comment on the Spotify post or send me a message on Instagram. While you're over on Instagram, give me a like and a follow. It's Thinking in English podcast. In fact, like, follow, leave a rating wherever you are listening right now on Apple or on Spotify. And head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. It's where the transcripts are. There's some other content on there. In the next few weeks, I'm thinking of starting to write a few more things. And yeah. Oh, and if you would like to donate to the podcast, you can always donate on the blog. So I hope you have an excellent Monday. Well, this is being released on Monday, but if you listen on Tuesday, have a good Tuesday as well. So, yeah, I'll see you next time.